You are walking through a forest in East Africa. The air is warm and humid. Birds call to each other in the canopy above, a rhythm you have heard every day of your life. You have no reason to think this morning is any different from the one before it. Then the sky begins to change. First a sound, a low, deep rumble that travels through the ground and up through your legs. You feel it in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The birds go silent. The insects stop humming. The forest holds its breath. And then, hours later, the ash begins to fall not gray but white, like fine snow drifting down from a cloudless sky. You have never seen anything like it. Neither has anyone in your tribe. For roughly 74,000 years, this moment was the closest our species ever came to vanishing completely from the Earth. And your existence today means that someone in your ancestral line lived through it. About 74,000 years ago, a volcano on the island of what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, erupted with a force unmatched in the last 25 million years. Its name was Mount Toba, but Toba was not a volcano in the way you imagine. It was a supervolcano, one of a handful on the planet capable of altering the entire global climate within days. When it erupted, it released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma into the atmosphere. To understand that scale, consider this. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected roughly 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. The column of ash and gas rose more than 50 kilometers into the sky, twice the height of the cruising altitude of a commercial jet. The immediate devastation was absolute. Everything within hundreds of kilometers was buried under meters of ash. Entire ecosystems were smothered in hours. But the real catastrophe spread far beyond Sumatra. Toba injected an estimated 6 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This sulfur dioxide formed sulfate aerosols that wrapped around the planet like a mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space. Global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, the cooling was even more severe, possibly as much as 10 degrees. The volcanic winter lasted 6 to 10 years, and its effects did not fully dissipate for another decade after that. For the scattered bands of early humans living across Africa and Asia, the world had suddenly become unrecognizable. Plant life collapsed. The large animals humans depended on for food died off or migrated to regions humans could not follow. Water sources became acidic and toxic with sulfur compounds. For the small, isolated groups of Homo sapiens scattered across the old world, the environment had turned hostile everywhere all at once, and stayed that way for nearly a generation. This is where the evidence takes a disturbing turn. In the 1990s, a geneticist named Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois proposed what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. Ambrose was studying patterns in mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child. He noticed something strange. By comparing the genetic diversity of modern humans to that of other species, he calculated that our ancestors had gone through an extreme population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago. The numbers were staggering. At some point in the deep past, the total number of breeding humans on Earth had fallen to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. That is not 10,000 people in one place. That is the entire reproductive population of our species, scattered across 2 continents. The timing of this bottleneck aligned with Toba's eruption almost perfectly. Ambrose argued that the supervolcano was the cause. And the genetics supported him. Modern humans have remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other great apes. There are more genetic differences between 2 individual chimpanzees from the same troop in West Africa than there are between any 2 humans alive on Earth today. Our lack of diversity is a signature of a near-extinction event. We are all descended from a remarkably small family tree. For years, this was the dominant narrative. Toba erupted, humanity was pushed to the brink, and every person alive today descends from a tiny band of survivors. It is a powerful story. It is also incomplete. In the early 2000s, archaeologist Michael Petraglia of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History traveled to southern India to investigate. At a site called Jewalapuram, he found a layer of volcanic ash deposited by the Toba eruption. Below that ash, he uncovered stone tools made by humans. Above the ash, he found more stone tools, strikingly similar in design and craftsmanship. The people living there before Toba erupted were still there after the ash had fallen. They had survived one of the most powerful geological events in Earth's history. And they were not alone. At Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologist Curtis Marion and his team found evidence that humans had adapted by shifting their diet to shellfish, a food source completely unaffected by the volcanic winter on land. Coastal populations had a buffer that inland groups did not. The ocean kept providing even when the land stopped. Other sites tell a more sobering story. In East Africa, several archaeological layers show evidence of abandonment during the Toba period. In Southeast Asia, the ash layers are thick enough to suggest that local human populations were decimated. The picture that emerges is not one of total extinction, but of fragmentation. Some populations survived. Many did not. The survivors were not concentrated in one place. They were scattered in small pockets, along coastlines, in sheltered valleys, in regions where the ash fall was lighter and the climate disruption was less severe. The 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals that Ambrose identified were the total sum of these survivors. They were not a single tribe. They were dozens of tiny bands, each fighting for survival in isolation, unaware that somewhere beyond the horizon, other humans were doing the same thing. So what did survival actually look like for them? Try to reconstruct a day. The sky is a dull, heavy gray. It has not been a clear blue for years. The sun appears only as a pale white disk behind the haze, barely strong enough to cast a shadow. The temperature has dropped. The familiar plants your ancestors once gathered no longer grow. The large game animals are gone, dead, or migrated to places too far to follow. Your band has not had a successful big hunt in months. Water must be tested before drinking, because sulfur has poisoned many of the sources. Each morning begins with a question that has no guarantee of an answer. Will we find enough food to keep everyone alive today? This is where the uniquely human response to crisis matters most. Early Homo sapiens had evolved something that no other hominin species possessed in the same degree: behavioral flexibility. You could adapt. You could eat a wider range of foods than any other large primate. You could process toxic plants through soaking, pounding, and cooking. You could follow small game into marginal terrain. You could dig for tubers, gather insects, trap birds, and harvest shellfish. The strongest humans did not survive Toba. The most flexible ones did. But there was another factor, and it may have been the most important one of all. Social cooperation. The same groups that shared food, cared for wounded members, and transmitted knowledge across generations were now the groups best equipped to survive a long-term catastrophe. A lone individual would have perished quickly. A band of 20 people who trusted each other, who divided labor, shared information about where water was still clean, and pooled whatever food they found, had a real chance. This is where the grandmother hypothesis carries new weight. Older women in these groups held a library of ecological knowledge that no one else possessed. They knew which underground tubers remained edible after a drought. They could recognize the subtle signs of a water source turning toxic. They remembered techniques for processing bitter plants that younger members of the group had never needed to learn. In a decade-long crisis, that stored knowledge was as vital as food itself. The bands that had living elders were the bands that survived. The recovery, when it came, was slow but steady. Once the ash settled and the stratosphere cleared, the surviving populations began to expand into the emptied landscapes around them. The genetic evidence shows a sharp population increase beginning around 60,000 years ago, exactly the pattern you would expect from a species emerging from a bottleneck. Those 10,000 or so survivors became the ancestors of every human being alive today. Every person on this planet, every language, every culture, every individual descends from someone who lived through the Toba supereruption. That fact carries a strange and sobering implication. The most destructive natural event in the last 25 million years was not powerful enough to eliminate our species, but it came terrifyingly close. The margin between survival and extinction was measured in kilometers, which side of a mountain your ancestors were living on, whether their territory was upwind or downwind of the ash cloud. It depended on whether a grandmother in the group remembered a specific edible root that kept the children alive through the third winter. It depended on luck. You are here today because of decisions made 74,000 years ago by people whose names you will never know. They were not smarter than the ones who died. They were not stronger. They may simply have been in the right place when the sky fell, and then, for a decade of darkness, they refused to stop looking for a way forward. That refusal is written into your DNA. It is the inheritance of every person alive. Your ancestors survived the worst day Earth has ever thrown at them. You carry that resilience in every cell of your body. You always have,